This is a workshop meeting, so we're going to go right to the agenda items. The 5 o'clock wastewater workshop, Route 28 proposed districts improvement financing project.
I know.
Working double duty tonight.
Would you look so different over there?
Yeah.
Black?
So ostensibly, this is to prepare you for a meeting of your 3-town Board of Selectmen meeting regarding DHY on Thursday, and that's largely what we're going to do. However, I did give myself 5 minutes at the beginning of this to just set the framework and some context for where we are. As you know, the Water Resource Advisory Committee has been working quite a bit on this over the past year. Several of our members are here tonight, and I'm kind of encapsulating their comments and recommendations to you. Then I'll turn it over to Dave Young from CDM to discuss most specifically the DHY status of that agreement and work. But since last spring, essentially, we've been doing a lot of one-on-one, initially, meetings with residents and business owners in town, and some small group outreach, homeowners groups, Realtors Association, tours, things of that nature. And then, as you know, this summer, over at the Cultural Center and at the Realtors Association, we did some larger public information sessions. And also, late spring over the summer, we began reaching out to various town boards and committees, CPC, Economic Development, Board of Health, Planning Board, Conservation Commission. I'm probably missing one or two. Just keep them up to date as to what we're working on. And in order to do all that outreach, we developed various tools and handouts. We've used Channel 18, we've used Facebook, we've used Constant Contact to get out some information, we've used some mailing lists that we have ourselves as well as from others to get out information. We developed some informational materials and some frequently asked answers to frequently asked questions, and some various maps that we have over here that we've used to explain all this and kind of get the community on board as to what the Water Resource Committee, Advisory Committee has been hearing and talking about. By and large, that discussion and that outreach effort has been very well received. Most people understand the issue, and they understand the need, and they want wastewater in one form or fashion to happen, is what our take is. The business community has indicated a really high level of support for wastewater initiatives, and they're willing to pay for it. And you'll hear later on after the RAC has done its presentation from one of your taxpayers that owns businesses in town to that point and has a proposal to put in front of you for consideration. Residents have expressed a lot of concern about what kind of community we would all be living in without clean water. This is a high importance issue on their radar. And to the contrary, very few have expressed reservations. And to the extent they have, and they've raised specific questions, I think the committee and the people supporting that committee have addressed those questions. And we probably do need to do more on those. And that's what we're working towards as we move forward. But the one underlying issue, as you probably all understand very well, is the issue of what's it cost. Everyone's concerned about the cost. It's an expensive proposition. So whether you're a supporter or a skeptic, everybody agrees that how you pay for this is important. So the RAC's been meeting since last November, getting up to speed on all the issues, learning about various options that they could consider to form the basis of a recommendation to the Board of Selectmen. The general consensus is that everyone feels that the town's nearing a crucial decision point on this issue for a number of reasons, some of which you'll hear about again tonight. And the bottom line is the Water Resource Advisory Committee feels that a centralized treatment system is the best solution. It's the most cost-effective for both capital and operating costs to address the level of nitrogen removal that our community needs across at least three watersheds which span the entire community. provides the most flexibility in order to adapt to future conditions, in particular contaminants of emerging concerns. And it would provide substantial value to homeowners, businesses, and the community at large. So, given all that, to kind of cut to the chase, there's really been a few things that they've been focused on in considering to further that discussion along. And the first one was a town of Yarmouth-only treatment solution with a treatment plan at Buck Island Road covering the 8 phases that you've heard about. And I've really been encouraging everyone to focus on the first 1 or 2 phases, because that's what's right in front of us. That's near term. It's almost too much to think about it, what's going to happen 40 years from now. And as I always tell everybody, we have to have a plan on paper to be able to say what we think we're going to do, but we know that plan is going to change. But phase 1 is a very real proposal that we have to address. And so that phase 1 is the idea that I've explained to you before of a central main collection pipe that sets up all future phases down Route 28 from Barnstable to Dennis. And our first option was a Yarmouth-only option with the treatment plant at Buck Island Road. The message that the committee got back from the board and the direction it's received was we ought to be looking at ways to reduce costs, and one of those ways potentially is by working with regional partners. And so we've reached out to Barnstable, and we've reached out to Dennis and Harwich, and you all are aware of the DHY partnership, community partnership work that has been ongoing with special legislation and an operating agreement, and that's what you're going to hear about tonight to see how attractive or how feasible that option is. We've also worked with Barnstable, and the long and the short of that on what the work's been on today is that it's more cost-effective to continue the work with DHY as far as collection and treatment. However, we do have opportunities to continue to pursue with Barnstable, and one of them in particular would be if we do something with DHY and where we would be sending our collecting and sending our wastewater to Dennis, would free up our Buck Island Road site, and Barnstable is in need of effluent recharge. And so we're exploring what's the possibility look like to work with them, which could be a financial benefit to the town, which we could then repurpose for paying for our ongoing infrastructure needs relating to wastewater as well. And then finally, that's been the heavy lifting the last several months. What does all that look like? The phasing is very similar in a Yarmouth go-it-alone process versus a DHY alternative. But what if we can't do that? And what about due diligence on other options? We've done quite a bit, but as we move forward, the Water Resource Advisory Committee will be considering what are some other alternatives to what has been being proposed and considered, and especially if we find that it's just too much for the community to handle all at one point. Could you do something smaller? And so we are looking at public-private partnerships. And one of those options is called a district improvement financing option, which you'll be hearing about from Lou Nicanello tonight, who's come up with this concept, and that we have already been aware of and are exploring. In addition, looking forward, going into the spring town meeting, the Water Resource Advisory Committee knows there's a lot of work left to be done, and it's looking to tighten up all the conceptual planning that's been done on the various options and try to answer as many questions as possible, and all that work is ongoing. It's a team effort from a lot of people on the town staff, planning and development, community development, myself, Public Works, Finance Department, as well as a really dedicated group of volunteers on the Water Resource Advisory Committee. They've done a great job. What they want to do is try to get as much information together as possible to provide some final recommendations to the board as we reach a decision point on this process. They do have 3 current recommendations that they just recently voted. Now that I'd like to move forward and send and communicate to you, and we'll be following this up with additional information. The first one you're already aware of, and I did send you out a one-pager discussing the Water Infrastructure Fund, Investment and Infrastructure Fund, the WIF, and you heard from CPC at your last meeting regarding that concept. The RAC is recommending that in all the scenarios that we're looking at for cost recovery, it is reliant upon that WIF being in place to help finance without having a impact on the property tax rate. The second recommendation was to adopt, and again, I'll be getting you more information for how we may implement this in the future at the appropriate time, but eventually to adopt a Water Resources Enterprise Fund. And that enterprise fund would not only account for wastewater, but the idea would be it would consolidate our water, which is under a old water surplus legislation, not an enterprise fund, our septic operation, as well as our stormwater, all which are accounted for differently throughout the town currently, and this would consolidate it into one fund. And that is for a number of reasons, but the pressing one, or the one that's largely under consideration now, is the ability to accumulate funds to help smooth out a financing plan and build up reserves for the particular projects we have in mind. And then finally, the third recommendation was to pursue finalization of a DHY agreement, with the idea being that we want to be able to present this as an option to our community. And as we've been talking about, we've been doing at least a dual track with a Yarmouth-only solution and a DHY solution. And of course, we still have a little bit of due diligence and evaluation to do on other alternatives, such as the public-private partnerships. But in any event, the committee feels it is very important to finish up that work and get it to a point where it can be available for consideration when this community needs to make a decision. And so with that wasn't quite 5 minutes, but I'll turn it over to Dave Young from CDM Smith to walk you through.
Thank you, Rich. Tap dance?
Of course.
Just briefly, this is what I plan to go through. First part would be quicker, because most of you have seen that, but just to refresh everyone's memory, particularly those who may be watching at home. Then get through some of the your Phase 1, which Rich briefly spoke about. Discuss some of the costs for the Town of Yarmouth, TOI option versus the Dennis Harwich Yarmouth option. And then discuss the status of the DHY agreement, review some of the cost recovery options that Rich will go through, and then talk about schedule. Just to give you an idea of who has been putting in all that hard work that Rich mentioned for the Water Resource Advisory Committee. This is the name, makeup of the committee. They truly have been providing a lot of good input, meeting initially for every couple weeks and recently monthly. So it's been valuable input. As many of you know, I like to start with these simple figures. This shows very briefly, pictorially, why we're here having the conversation, because Yarmouth has changed. Over the last 50 years, all you got to do is look at the colors. Green meant it was undeveloped. Yellow and red now means it's been developed. So significant change in development, as well as population and many other factors. That has led to what we refer to as a nitrogen issue. Nitrogen coming mainly from on-site septic systems, which you'll see in a moment. But it's not something we're predicting has happened. It's something that has happened. And it's also shown here, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection periodically has aerial flights done of the Massachusetts coastline to track eelgrass through those aerial flights. And as you can see, over this almost 20-year period, there's been a fair amount of eelgrass loss in the shorelines of Yarmouth, And why are we tracking eelgrass? Well, eelgrass is essentially the canary in the mine type of concept, that if you have eelgrass, you have a healthy water quality. If you don't have the eelgrass, you've got the degraded water quality, and that's why it's been lost. If you look at the mouth of the Bass River, over here, Parker's River, you can see there was much more up in there, so you're getting the degraded water quality coming from those watersheds coming down into Nantucket Sound. Where does the, quote, controllable nitrogen source come from? The reason we say controllable is this does not include atmospheric nitrogen, which is a result of the power plants in the, out in the Midwest. So the vast majority is coming from wastewater, that being the on-site Title V septic system, which is the predominant form of waste management here on the Cape, let alone in Yarmouth. So 85% of the nitrogen, plus or minus, in the watersheds is coming from those on-site septic systems. And then the fertilizer, stormwater components are in the 7 to 8% range, again, depending on the specific watershed. So we shouldn't forget those two components, and there are recommendations that have been in your comprehensive wastewater management plan, and will be, and you already know you're working on your stormwater program, but the vast majority and the main focus is on wastewater. This is just a cross-section of through a typical Title V subsurface septic system. Perfectly operating system only removes about 10 to 15% nitrogen. So you need to remove, or you need to maintain it, but Title V septic systems were designed to remove solids, pathogens, viruses. They weren't designed to remove nitrogen. You have to get into a much more sophisticated system to get higher levels. It's essentially a small treatment plant on your site. And particularly due to the nature of the use here on the Cape, seasonality, at best they remove about 50, maybe 60% of the nitrogen. And as you can see from this figure, this shows the main watersheds, the 3 main watersheds in Yarmouth. Lewis Bay over here, this being the town line, and then the town line going up the Bass River. The Bass River watershed is in this green area. You have to remove about 60% of the nitrogen coming from those Title V systems. Parker's River, 96%, and your share of Lewis Bay, about 80%. So looking at those other innovative alternative systems wouldn't get us to that percent removal that's required. The good news is this shows the area where you have your 20-plus drinking water wells. By and large, you've done a very good job of protecting those. You have very good drinking water here in town. But you do have some wells over in this Captain Parker's area that have shown over the last 30 years a steady increase in nitrogen content, and that's mainly due to the development in that area. But you've got 3 wells that are up over 5 parts of nitrogen. The drinking water standard by EPA is 10, but the Cape Cod Commission and the state look at 5 as really a guideline to stop using a well, which the town has essentially done for those wells. But again, the good news is you have several other wells that you can use. And then we've also looked at your freshwater ponds. You have data on 5 of your ponds that you've been sampling on a regular basis. Really only 1 of them has shown impacts that would require sewering around it to remove phosphorus. Phosphorus is the nutrient of concern for freshwater ponds. Nitrogen is the nutrient of concern for saltwater estuaries. So really Long Pond, which is down gradient from that Captain's Village area and other higher density developments. The recommendation is for the town to be looking at sampling other ponds moving forward to get better data and evaluate programs for them into the future. Within the last year, the town also hired the Donahue Institute at UMass Boston to do an economic study, and it was a fairly narrow study. The main topics or questions to be addressed were what would happen if Yarmouth implemented a wastewater program, and essentially what would happen if they didn't implement a wastewater program, and what would be the benefits or the negative aspects of either. You can see the summary. The program or the report is posted on your website. But essentially, the bottom line is that the number one impediment to significant redevelopment along, particularly, they pulled out a few examples along Route 28, is the absence of the wastewater utility here in town. There are other numbers quoted in there that for like every dollar invested in wastewater infrastructure, you get a $15 return for that. A lot of businesses that they spoke to here in town, the business owners just flat out said they don't want to be in the wastewater business, so they'd love to have that utility so that then they can make the investment in their facilities. As Rich noted, the Water Resource Advisory Committee has made some conclusions, recommendations. Just to reiterate, they recommend the most cost-effective solution is a single centralized treatment facility. It achieves the best nitrogen removal, has the ability to address contaminants of emerging concern going forward, and provides just the overall best value to businesses and homeowners here in town. This is the program that has been developed. It includes now the Bass River watershed. I realize that it's a little bit washed out, but if it's been colored in, it means it's part of a phased sewer program that shows the amount of area or homes that need to be collected to reach those % nitrogen removals that we showed back a few figures ago. And this was a first pass at how the 8 phases, roughly 1 phase every 5 years to be implemented over a 40-year program, would be implemented. And as you can see here, phase 1 is essentially Route 28 from the Barnstable line to the Dennis line and then down along South Shore Drive. It picks up the largest water users in town, and it picks up and removes nitrogen from each of the 3 watersheds, and essentially builds the core or the spine for the wastewater program going forward into the future. As you can see, it's quite a bit different program than what had been proposed back in 2011, where only half of Route 28 was being done from the Barnstable line over to Parker's River with the local treatment plant at the Buck Island Road site. So the reason the Water Resource Advisory Committee recommended this first phase is that it does address all 3 watersheds, nitrogen removal, that is the spine, helps meet the needs of what was defined in the economic development to help pay for the program, but it also provides a lot of flexibility and is adaptive going forward into the future. So this is really the main focus on phase 1. As Rich said, and we've said many times, the other 7 phases, there's some flexibility there to meet the needs of the town, which will change over time. So even though we've given a guideline for how those 8 phases might be implemented, you should really focus on trying to get phase 1 moving, because everything then feeds off of that phase. This shows the number of parcels and the so-called build-out flow for each of those 8 phases. If you followed that plan that was put forth on the slide, the number of parcels connected in that first phase, it's lower than all the others because it's mainly focused on commercial lots versus smaller residential lots. The vast majority is commercial development, but it has by far the highest flow. That's why I said it picks up the largest water users. But also remember, build-out flow is the flow that is a result of what could be built under your current zoning, or in this instance, there's been a flow allowance included in your commercial areas for some potential revisions to zoning going forward. And that was a result, again, of some of the input from that economic study. Your planning department and economic development department have put a lot of work into looking at all those parcels. And so your flow projection overall just went up by about 280,000 gallons a day to that revised number of 3.5 million that you see down below for the whole total. And again, most of that is in that 909,000 number. So that's where your program is at the moment. We've been working with the towns of Dennis, Harwich, and Yarmouth in similar wastewater programs, and all three had been challenging us over the years to how can we lower the cost. So back almost 3 years ago now, we had proposed to look at doing a regional community partnership type approach. So for the last 2.5 years, due to the goodness of 2 state grants, there's been a lot of work done to look at creating the DHY Clean Waters Community Partnership. There is now a website, and this is the link to that website, that is up and running and has the latest documents that the subgroup, which has been meeting monthly for that past 2.5 years, has all the meeting minutes, the draft operating agreement, special legislation and status of where it is, all the presentations. There is another 3-town meeting this coming Thursday, the 19th, in Harwich at the Community Center at 6 o'clock. But you can go to this website and get the latest instead of trying to figure out, does town of Yarmouth have the latest, or Harwich, or this or that. And then there's links back to each town's website for their wastewater program as well. So it goes back and forth each way. Just a quick overview of what has been done. Again, the subgroup was formed back in June 2017. It was actually meeting before that. This was just where it was really formalized. 3 towns authorized the filing of the special legislation over a year ago. At each of the town meetings, that special legislation was filed, had to be refiled this year. It didn't make it through the session last year. Have been having some more joint committee meetings. The MFN, Mansfield, Foxborough, Norton, commissioners and executive director came down, spoke to the 3 towns last fall. The special legislation has actually passed now in August, the House, and is in the Senate. Senator Sear and his staff are actively monitoring it. They've had it pulled out, and it's actually been assigned to a committee now. So they're very optimistic that it will be passed within the next month or so. It's very similar to the special legislation that was filed to create that MFN Regional Wastewater District. So the thought being that we have between now and next spring to continue the education, local sessions, and make sure that everybody in the 3 towns has their questions answered. We'd like to make sure that the agreement is more or less agreed to in the communities by this December, so that everybody is looking at the same agreement and selling that same agreement or discussing it between December and your May town meeting. But right now, the schedule would be that the 3 towns would discuss and I should say the special legislation requires the agreement to be approved at each town town meeting prior to creating the Clean Waters Partnership. So everything's leading towards next May's annual town meetings for that. This shows the flows that would be conveyed to a single treatment plant, which would be located in Dennis, near their DPW building. So Dennis is a little under 2 million gallons, Harwich is a little under 1 million, and Yarmouth is about 3.5, or 55% for Yarmouth, 15% for Harwich, and 30% for Dennis. The wastewater, as I said, would be sent to Dennis, treatment plant there, and then the highly treated wastewater effluent, the liquid portion, would be sent back to all three communities over time. And this just shows the shared effluent recharge sites. There are 6 of them that have been identified in the 3 towns, and that's part of the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. Those sites were identified and have been evaluated in each of the individual towns' components. As Rich noted earlier, you don't see the Buck Island Road site listed there because these 6 sites would be able to take the 6.5 million gallons of flow as anticipated, and they're closer to the treatment plant site. However, if any of those sites were to fall off, you might be falling back to looking at the Buck Island Road site. Particularly the Yarmouth Bass River Golf Course, which I know is a discussion item in itself, but that is projected to be able to take 2 million gallons of effluent. If for some reason that was not used, you would need to use the Buck Island Road site. This is, again, a little bit washed out, but this really takes the 8 phased plans from each of the 3 communities, puts it together into one plan, and shows some different conveyance options and how it would be phased together. Harwich is looking at rephasing what they were doing. They're currently on construction now for sewers up in East Harwich. They're phase 2, as they refer to it. They've revised that their next phase would now be down here in Herring River, as well as paying for their portion of the treatment plant. But they want to make sure if they're paying for the treatment plant, they're sending some flow there. We've been looking at different connection options for Harwich to the Dennis and for Yarmouth into Dennis. Originally, we were doing, and a lot of the costs have been built off, Yarmouth pumping wastewater over to a common pumping station here at Route 134 and 28. Similarly, Harwich would pump over to that same pumping station, and then potentially the DHY would own that pumping station, the force mains, and then up to the treatment plant. Recently, we've been working with town staff in all 3 towns, and we've been looking at potentially a more less challenging and similar cost for Yarmouth to actually pump directly from down here on 28 directly over to the treatment plant, and for Harwich to pump directly up Depot Street to the treatment plant. You'd be going over High Bank Road, and Dennis would own everything in Dennis. That way, each community is on their own schedule, does their own internal systems. I want to reiterate again that the collection systems remain totally within town control, and that is roughly 75% or more of your overall wastewater program cost. So DHY is just for treatment and effluent recharge. This is a cost overview of what we refer to as the shared facilities. And again, this is for the treatment and the effluent recharge. And here we show the town cost, meaning if you were doing it on your own and not part of the DHY program, and these are the costs under, quote, regional, if you were doing it. So looking at Yarmouth, in this, for treatment and effluent recharge, it costs you about $132 million. It's about 116 million as part of the DHY program. More importantly, the operating cost is where you have your real economy of scale savings. Instead of being 8.9, and these are costs that the build-out flows, 8.9 million, you're about half of that at 4.8. And that, again, is because you're sharing that cost of that facility, paying roughly 55% of that, and then the equivalent annual cost. So you can see the savings are fairly significant. The cost breakdown by some of the more major components, as I indicated, of your overall $456 million in-town program, the collection system is $324 million. So that's what I mean. You're over 75+% of your totally under Yarmouth control. That has nothing to do with DHY. And it costs you a little bit more, though, to conveyance and collection to send it to Dennis. Makes sense. You're conveying it to a further destiny, being over in Dennis versus to your Buck Island Road site, which is where your treatment plant for the in-town solution is proposed to be located. But you make it up down here in the treatment plant. So that cost savings is offset here by sharing in building one treatment plant and paying your share of that, about equal for effluent recharge and other non-traditional items. So overall, net, you do have a cost savings, but being that close and being up that high, they're very close. Some would say they're similar. Again, your O&M cost is where your real savings is, so that by the time you get over and do your annual savings, you do have an annual savings on equivalent annual cost basis. This is if you looked at the overall programs, again, putting the collection system back in with the shared cost. You can see, instead of 456 million, the 450, as we showed before, ultimately a 13% annual savings on an equivalent annual cost basis. But this is the slide that I don't think it was in your packets. Do we hand it out? That we'd like you to focus on. This is just phase 1 and 2. Instead of trying to look 40 years out, this takes the first 10 years of the program. Because people have said, well, all right, that's 40 years out. What does it really mean to me in the first phase or second phase? So if you look at the cost of that, again, the collection system, what you would be doing, you're paying a little bit more to get there. But again, you're saving significantly, $20 million on the treatment plant. The treatment plant would be built essentially about half the capacity of what would be required at build-out. You're not going to build the whole treatment plant, certainly in the first phase. But some things, the administration building, the lab, the building of houses, some of the mechanical equipment, it's not a straight proportion, 50% of a building type of thing. So there is more money up front, but you are having that savings. So overall, instead of 184 by doing it on your own, you're saving about $6 million. But again, look at the savings in the O&M projected, which then results in savings on your equivalent annual cost. So even just looking at the first phase or two, you do have some significant savings.
Dave, I just want to point out on that slide, because it's different than some of the numbers you may have heard before, that does include some interest costs, which we're hoping to do, especially on a regional approach, at a 0% loan through the SRF program.
Yeah, whenever we have done our equivalent annual costs, we've always been at the state revolving fund loan rate of 2.25%. It's a 2% loan, but they put on a 0.25 administrative fee. Regionalization, though, we would hope to qualify, and that's one of the cost savings measures. Doing things through a regional fashion in a competitive state revolving fund loan program moves you much higher up. And so we're trying to do everything we can to get you qualified for 0% interest loans instead of the 2.25, and that has a significant savings impact for you. One of the other cost-saving measures, I think we've shown this briefly. We're trying to actually get this updated at some of the previous presentations, but there are several projects that the Mass Department of Transportation is looking to do along Route 28 from Barnstable all the way through Harwich. And as we just showed, your Phase 1 program is mainly along Route 28. So if you focus in on Yarmouth, we've been in close contact with the project managers at the Mass Department of Transportation, and they have indicated that they would do the project. We would give them the pipe to put in the ground, design it, and the town would pay for it, but they would do essentially the surface work, mainly the paving and all the, police details and all those other things. So that's some significant savings if we can get that coordinated, particularly with what we've been seeing is paving prices up about 50% here on the Cape lately on some projects that have recently been bid. So people keep saying, well, how much is that? Well, a lot of it depends on when it's done, how it's coordinated, and this and that. But, you're probably in the $50 to over $100 a linear foot type of savings, which can be some significant money. As I said, we're also trying to get you qualified for the State Revolving Fund Loan Program. The reason I put this up, so you can get 0% interest loan, is there are 5 criteria that are required for the town to qualify for that 0% interest loan. And that is that the project is related to nutrient removal, that you are not subject to any enforcement order or legal proceeding, that you have an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan, which you had back in 2011. The work we're doing now, we will file what's known as a notice of project change to update that plan. And we've been in contact with the state permitting agencies to make sure they're on board with that. That's consistent with the Regional Water Resources Plan, which the Cape Cod Commission has been actively involved, and you've been filing your annual reports with that. And that the community has adopted what's known as land use controls. And that's why I said it was important for your planning staff to give us that 280,000 gallon a day flow increase number, because what this land use control will do is you will need to manage to the flows that you have put in your comprehensive wastewater management plan, and have a system in place that allows you to manage to those flows for that. If one of those you didn't qualify for, again, you would then default back to being eligible for the 2% interest loans. But as Rich pointed out, even at 2%, that can add up pretty quickly when you're paying that interest, particularly on the size projects that we're looking at. Again, regional approach gains you more points in that competitive process as more communities start to move forward. The state revolving fund, the bucket of money they have every year, they're required to put a minimum of a third of that into zero interest loans. That's going to go quicker as other programs start to move forward. And Yarmouth does qualify for principal forgiveness. However, that amount changes on an annual basis depending on how much money is available, depending on the per capita income studies they do. So that ranges from 1% to 5 or 6%. And you don't know till you actually get into that program. So moving over to the status briefly of the DHY agreement. Wanted to make sure that we gave you a brief overview again leading into Thursday's meeting. Again, we got into this because we're trying to lower the cost for all 3 communities using economy of scale. After looking at several governance-type structures, the subcommittee felt that using the MFN template was the best, which essentially creates a separate entity under the Mass General Law, and that's therefore the requirement for filing the special legislation in order to do that. The Clean Waters Community Partnership would be governed by a commission made up of 7 members, 3 of them representing the town of Yarmouth, appointed by the Board of Selectmen, acting as sewer commissioners, 2 from the town of Dennis, and 2 from the town of Harwich. Board of Selectmen or a designated authority, again, acting as commissioners, would be the ones appointing. Dennis is the only one who has a split appointing. And the day-to-day operations of that partnership would be overseen and managed by an executive director who would be hired by the partnership. The commissioners, to make sure that towns felt comfortable with who would be in that role, was actually defined to be either the town administrator, DPW director, wastewater superintendent or equivalent, sewer commissioner, member of the Board of Selectmen, finance committee member, or a qualified town resident. They would serve for 3-year rotating terms, and they can be removed by their appointing authority as you can on other committee assignments in the community. This was the last change that had been made to the process, and I think we had a good discussion here last spring when this was brought up. This was the one change made to the special legislation from when it was filed last fall to being refiled and amended this past spring. And this was to amend the budget process, or I should say the budget approval process. The way it was originally put forth was that the commission would issue an annual budget in early November. They would also include a 5-year capital outlay budget look-ahead. They would come and discuss it with the communities during November, December, receive appropriate feedback, and then they would go back and make any adjustments, and they would require a 2/3 vote on their part to approve it, and then they would issue it. Well, the step that was added in was now in January, December or early January, there would now be a commission and 3-town joint Board of Selectmen's meeting to approve the draft partnership budget that had been put forth. And it would need to be approved by a majority vote of those present selectmen members at that meeting. And a quorum for that meeting is at least 2 selectmen from each community and at least 8 total selectmen present from the 3 towns. And then they would go back, once that was approved, the commission would need to again adopt it with a 2/3 vote versus just a majority vote for the draft. Again, just a higher standard for approval of that. So I think that's a good check and balance that's been put in and requested by all 3 towns. And that is further detailed in the agreement. Just briefly, there are some other quorum requirements. Non-financial issues only requires majority of the commissioners, but 1 from each, representing each community for any type of vote. Financial issues over 30,000 requires 5 commissioners present, 1 from each community. And the executive director has the ability to approve items 30,000 or less. Apportionment of cost. Tried to keep this simple. It's broken into capital and operating cost. The capital costs are apportioned based on the percentage of the average daily flow capacity owned in the treatment plant by a given community. So if you looked at the build-out flows, we saw 55% for Yarmouth, you would be paying 55% of the capital cost The operating costs have been split into two components. They're broken into semi-fixed cost, which is essentially a lot of the overhead staff, the things that don't change based on whether you're getting 10 gallons or 1 million gallons into the plant. It's what it is. And then the flow variable cost, which would be a portion based on the percentage of the actual wastewater flow from a community that goes to the treatment plant. So if you are connected to the plant and you don't send 1 gallon of flow there, you're still going to pay the semi-fixed cost portion, but you're not going to pay any of the flow variable. And the flow variable, from experience looking at many other facilities, was identified as 3 items, being electricity, chemicals, and solids disposal. The Phase 1 cost estimates, it's been updated. You actually at 126 million, but Rich's numbers, which he'll go through in a minute, are all based on the 112, so this is a slide from that. And the zero interest loan, using what the SRF program allowed you to go from 20-year loans up to 30 now, so that's what the numbers have been based off. So you're looking at 3.73 at that 112. It's a little higher now at the 126. And you've been working to develop the cost without hitting the general tax rate. So with that, you want to take that?
Sure. So we've included several funding options to be able to pay that $3.7 million of debt service without hitting the tax rate. Obviously, before we even think about paying for it from our own resources, be seeking out a lot of grant opportunities. Of course, the second item there, the main item of funding that you've started to discuss, is the Water Infrastructure Investment Fund, the WIF. And in our planning purposes, we've used a 1.5% WIF. We still have to see how it works out with the Cape and Islands Water Protection Trust. We just got another meeting notice that's coming up soon. But in our plan, we did indicate that we were relying on, of course, it's cut off. I think it was 25% of our funding from the Water Protection Trust. We are discussing and planning on implementing a flow-based betterment program for Phase 1. We'd reevaluate that as you move forward in future phases. So sometimes it's hard to answer the question of what it's going to cost me, because we don't know what's going to cost you in Phase 2 and beyond. But we certainly are developing what the costs are for the Phase 1 users. We've talked about the 25% capital surcharge on an operating rate. That's part of it. We've talked about utilizing short-term rental bill revenues from the new short-term rentals, from private rentals like Airbnb. We do have a couple solar projects coming online that you'll be hearing about shortly that we're projecting savings that we're hoping we can reallocate towards funding this plan, and a small amount of septic plant receipts or water operation operating cost savings. One of the big items is not included in our plan that I'm going to show you on the next slide, but is going to be a topic of discussion with Lou, is the idea of new growth from development that occurs within the town. And so what I've explained to you in the past is we have a certain level of new growth that occurs naturally each year, roughly, I don't know the exact number. It's different every year, but for talking purposes, perhaps $300,000 to $350,000 a year. But what would it look like if, because of ongoing development year after year in the community, that our new growth added to our tax levy each year was double that, or 2/3 of that? That additional incremental revenue could be added as a funding source, which would have no impact on the tax rate as it exists today on the property taxpayer. And of course, we also have, as we've talked about in the past, debt drop-off. As current projects are being paid off, can we repurpose that debt that our taxpayers are accustomed to paying at that level for ongoing debt service related to wastewater? So that's kind of the menu of options. The most significant of those that are not in our current plan is that new growth tax revenue. And that's to the heart of what you're going to hear from one of our business owners in town. when it comes to a district improvement financing district. So to summarize all that, our annual debt service cost at $3.7 million, funded by our user-generated revenues of septic plant, 25% surcharge on the operating rate, our betterment program of just over $1.1 million, our water infrastructure fund of just over $1 million, our dedicated local receipts being short-term rentals and solar savings of about $695,000, and the Water Protection Trust as a planning number here of about $933,000. Leaves us with about a $70-some-odd thousand surplus. And as Dave indicated, we've been updating all our cost numbers as we go, but not wanting to change my projection every time something changes. I haven't updated that yet, but we were from this being at $112 million to now being at about $126 million with our latest estimates updated for inflation and the results of actual project costs that we are currently being bid and those bids being received. So, and the increase of flows for the town of Yarmouth. I've mentioned in the past, it's really important to smooth out our plan in the extent, as I indicated in the year-to-year of this, when I showed it to you in the past, there was a 1 year or two where there was a shortfall, but we can smooth out those shortfalls and any shortfalls of any of these estimates in any given year by pre-funding the plan starting in FY '21, preferably, if not '22. And we already talked about the Water Resource Enterprise Fund from the Water Resource Advisory Committee. So I'll turn it back to Dave, where we get into our next steps, and finally your questions.
As you can see here, this is just an attempt to try to lay out what was going forward till next spring. Subgroups continuing to meet. Been meeting on a monthly basis. Communities are holding local meetings like this to educate committee members, residents. There are some town meetings scheduled for this fall. Some communities are looking to bring cost recovery funding articles to that meeting. But the focus is gearing up towards the May annual town meetings next spring now. The goal would be, if they was approved then, that the commission would be formed in June, July type timeframe, and that the commissioners, once it's formed, can start to apply for the $1 million that Representative Whalen had put in the environmental bond bill for DHY. That can't be accessed till DHY is actually formed. And then they could start to hire the executive director and start into the design process for the treatment plant and effluent recharge sites. Theoretically, the communities would be doing the same for their collection systems, so that roughly 5 years out, the first gallon of flow would be able to be received and start to be treated. So if you approved everything next spring, you're still looking at 5 years out before you can treat that first gallon. So with that, we'd be happy to try to answer any questions. Just some summary thoughts. Having been through this with other communities and 2.5 years with this subgroup, you know, it's always tough. A lot of people want to get down into what's it for this community or that community or what have you, but you know, the governor has been down here supporting this at One Cape, and I keep remembering his quote, focus on the 90% you can agree to, not the 10% that you may never agree upon. You know, there's a lot of benefits in this partnership option. It's an exciting opportunity, and we'll see where it goes. So, and plug for Rich. He's been doing a great job with all this outreach, and if anyone hasn't signed up to get water resource advisories as new information's posted or whatever, it's very easy to do. You can just text to that number, and everything's automated. Once you do that, by putting in your email address. So he's done a great job with that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave, for your presentation, and Rich, thank you as well. Who on the board would like to start with questions? Norm? Do you have questions?
Can. I have a number, yes.
I figured you did.
One is related to the Buck Island site. You know, for a long time, we've talked about Buck Island, and I don't even know how many acres of land we have there that are, and what it is right now. Is it all forested? How many acres are involved? And so I have a couple of questions on that. And we've talked about it for years as being reserved for the wastewater treatment plant. And I guess, and then now it's also being talked about as an alternative for effluent recharge from Hyannis. I guess I'm wondering at this point, what are the alternate uses of that property? And how do potential alternate uses, for example, economic development, compare to any revenues we might receive from effluent recharge from Hyannis? Might we be better off planning for the utilization of that property in some other fashion? And again, I don't know what the acreage is, what the topography is, and so forth. And it may not be something you're able to address. I think, you know, it may be something the administration has to address, or planning and zoning.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact acreage of the site. We could certainly look that up and get it to you. But right now, it serves as the backup effluent recharge site for your Dennis Yarmouth septic facility. So there's still the irrigation system there, and it's just an open field. However, all that effluent now can be used at the golf courses, and so it's minimal use from that facility now, because once they put a gallon of water in there any quarter, they have to start the sampling program. There are several monitoring wells, and that's a DEP requirement. So they're trying not to do that. But it still exists for that purpose right now. You know, there's tens of acres there. I forget the exact number. I'll guess
Jeff's
50.
here.
Oh,
Jeff
I think
Colby's
Jeff Colby has some information for us.
If I could, real quickly, Jeff Colby, Public Works Director. Let's not forget that site is also the Water Division operations site as well. So not only is there offices there, but there's also the vehicle storage and maintenance operation happens there as well. It's a good synergy related to wastewater and a water resources enterprise that we've been talking about if that was to be located at that site. But as Dave said, there is currently a septage spray irrigation field that takes up approximately 17 acres on that site. The entire site's probably close to 40 acres, I believe, but currently it is an open field for approximately 17 of those acres, which is a spray irrigation field.
So 17 out of 40 is used for spray irrigation?
Yes, in that proximate neighborhood, absolutely.
So 23 acres. Now, would that additional 23 acres be assigned to the DHY partnership for effluent recharge?
Currently, that site's not being considered as part of the DHY effluent recharge sites. That was what David mentioned in the presentation.
I'm sorry. I meant in Hyannis.
Right, well, that's the option we'd be considering is what could we do with that site as a community if we didn't have to utilize it ourselves for our own effluent recharge area?
Right. What are some other options that are being explored currently?
Okay.
In any event.
So before we make any agreement whatsoever with Hyannis, we'd need to evaluate what the alternate uses are.
Right, in any event,
Absolutely.
we would have a legal requirement to get an appraisal at a minimum and determine the value of that land and consider alternative uses, you know, that would approximate or better than that value.
Right. Okay. All right. So that really doesn't have anything to do with the DHY effort at this stage.
That's correct.
It doesn't in the sense that it's not part of DHY, but it does in the sense if you have kind of contemplating that as a benefit perhaps, that you're maintaining control of that site for your own use.
Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think, some concerns have been expressed, certainly concerning the golf course, and I'm not sure whether that's off the table or has been deferred as a potential recharge site at this stage, where the discussions have headed. Can you kind of tell us where we are on that?
Well, we for the town of Yarmouth, have been evaluating that site. We did a pilot test out there this past summer. We believe that we can comfortably put 2 million gallons of effluent there
day?
in subsurface leaching fields.
Is that per day?
Yes,
2 million gallons per day?
yes.
Okay.
So it has significant effluent recharge capacity.
So it's about half of Yarmouth's total,
Yes.
Phase 8 total.
Yeah, if you were doing
of gallons.
Yarmouth, an in-town Yarmouth solution only, your two effluent recharge sites were the Buck Island Road site and the Bass River Golf Course site.
Okay. Okay. So nothing has been decided at this stage with regard to timing of potential use of the Bass River Golf Course then?
Well, right now, in the costs that have been presented, it is in the first phase of use for the DHY option. There's a smaller site over next to the, where the treatment plant would be located in Dennis, at the DPW site. But that's probably only 350,000 gallons per day.
Okay.
So the next site that had been identified that's closest to that site and of large capacity was the Bass River Golf Course. The one after that would be the infiltration basin site over in Harwich next to their DPW, which is about 1 million gallons per day
Okay.
of capacity.
Okay, so in terms of phases of need and I don't know what the phases in Dennis and Harwich, what the number of gallons that would be estimated in their early stages, whether they would, whether that in combination with our Phase 1 and 2 would require getting into using Bass River. I'm trying to get an idea of the calendar of projected impact on Bass River.
Well, right now, Bass River was envisioned to be one of the first ones, but nothing's been formally decided because we're still evaluating options at Bass River, what that might look like going forward. But from a hydraulic point of view, we feel comfortable that 2 million gallons could go there, but there are other issues that need to be still further discussed.
Okay. All right, well, let's say it's, it would be needed during Phases 1 and 2. When would construction need to be started?
That would be in that design timeframe of within the next 5 years.
Within the next 5 years. So, but it would have to exist. Obviously, you have to have the disposal site for the effluent
Right.
ready to go.
So it would need to be
At the same
designed
time,
and
you-
built within the next 5 years, if that were one of the first sites.
sometime in the
Years 3 to 5.
3 to 5 from now. Okay.
Now, you don't need to build, and we've had these discussions, and again, nothing decided, you don't need to build all 2 million gallons on day one either. You could potentially do the first 1 million gallons because all the flow's not going to show up at the treatment plant
Right.
the first 6 months either. So you might be able to offset that within a couple seasons to try to minimize impacts to the golf course. But then we've had discussions of trying to just, well, maybe do a fall and do it all at once. A lot of variables that could be put in play there to try to minimize impact on the golf course.
Okay. Okay. I guess another question that I was trying to understand is the conveyance system costs that were on Exhibits 25 and 27. I was trying to reconcile those They seem to be two different numbers, and I didn't know why. '25, for example, shows collection system costs, capital costs, and '27 shows collection system capital costs with different numbers.
That's on phase 1 and 2.
I think that's just round up. This is 8.4, and the previous one says 8 million.
Well, the first one, 25, is the build-out costs for all 8 phases. 27 is just phase 1 and 2.
Okay. So then for the wastewater treatment facility, phase 1 and 2 would be the regional cost would be 54 million for phase 1 and 2. And
Right, because essentially you're building a treatment plant to handle the first 4 phases of flow. So you have to build that in phase 1, even though this is phase 1 and 2 costs. You don't, so that's a phase 1 cost, there's nothing in phase 2.
okay. So let's go back to then the sharing of costs. If the shared costs of the collection system in phases 1 and 2, which is the first 10 years, is going to be some smaller fraction of the total capital costs, then why is Yarmouth being asked to pay 55% of the total when the total is based upon full completion of the system?
Because you own 55% of the flow capacity of whatever system is built, whether it's the first phase of the treatment plant or the build-out flow phase of the treatment plant. The examples that are put forth are you own 55% of that treatment plant.
So the 55, so you're saying the numbers are consistent between the first phase?
To keep the math simple, we kept the same percentages in the first phase of construction.
But the agreement, and Dave, you can explain this better than I, provides for an initial percentage share versus the build-out share, correct?
Right. If for some reason you decided you did not want to build 55% of that and the number came out 45%, you would only pay 45%. The agreement is written that you pay for what that community's owned capacity is in the treatment plant.
Okay. But I guess what I'm trying to understand is our percentage of the capacity 55% for phase 1 and 2? Is
No,
that
that's the first
how much
4 phases.
Excuse me?
That's the first 4 phases. The treatment, you're going to build the treatment plant to handle flow for the first 4 phases. So even on those costs that we're showing, this phase 1 and 2, as I said, all that cost is really in phase 1. Phase 2 is 0, phase 3 is 0, phase 4 is 0. And then you're going to build the next phase.
And I guess to that point, Mr. Holcomb, you have 2 bites at the apple, as I understand it. So in other words, in phase 1, let's say the calculation is we don't want to do 55%. Let's do 45%, just for the sake of argument. You're going to pay 45%. If the goal is at the end of the program of the 8 phases, you want to get to that 55%, that means in the second bite at the apple, when you have to upgrade the plant 20 years out,
Right.
you're going to be picking up more capacity at that time. So it's a 2-phased approach.
Okay. Right now, 55, the final build-out percentage is being used for the entire 40 or 50 years of the project.
Yeah, but there's an example in the agreement, and I think it actually was one of the requests from someone in Yarmouth. We added in suppose there needs to be an interim expansion of the treatment plant. And say it's 1 million gallons, and Yarmouth wanted 750,000 of that, and the other two split the 250. You would pay 75% of the expansion,
Right.
and then once the expansion was completed, you would take the total ownership again, and it would be some other number.
Yeah, okay. Get back to my list if I could find it. I'm not sure when we talked about representation on the committee that governs the facility, what our percentage was of the wastewater flow. But it's a 7-member committee, and now we're projecting 55% ownership, essentially, which comes out to 3.8 members of the committee. And the committee, but we're apparently assigned, based on the previous discussions we had, of having 3 members on the committee. And I guess I'm growing concerned about this, that, you know, we've got an ever-increasing percentage of responsibility, financial responsibility, for the facility, and yet we're stuck at an underrepresentation. We don't have a majority position on the operating committee. And I guess just only started thinking about this at this stage. You know, I'm concerned that limitation applying to the financial commitments that we're making is a constraint on Yarmouth. And I'm very concerned that we are being underrepresented with regard to the financial decisions on the plant. And I'm wondering if we should be rethinking this and looking at a 4-person representation or 4-person vote count with regard to the financial decisions, with regard to the budget, for example, and as opposed to a 3-member representation. And I'm just throwing that idea out. I guess, you know, given that our percentage ownership, quote unquote, has been increasing, you know, I think we need to think about that and think about our representation.
I guess it's still open, but just to give you a little bit of history, how we got to the 322, you may recall for many months we were at 221. 2 members from Yarmouth, 2 from Dennis, and 1 from Harwich. Towards the end, a little over a year ago, there was concern that, well, what did really 1 vote mean when you're discussing all these items? Even though there were quorum definitions in there to be able to take votes, you needed representatives from each town, so that everybody was there having those discussions. That's when it got bumped up to Yarmouth getting 3 to keep it the odd number, and Harwich was given a 2nd representative. There was really a concession on Dennis's part to give the 3rd at that point. But they were, from Yarmouth's perspective, said, well, they're getting the treatment plant, you don't have the treatment plant.
Mm-hmm.
So
There are
that's why I think there was
countervailing
a lot of give and take on all sides, and I think at the time anyway, there was satisfaction with the 322, but that's how we got to where we are today.
Understand, yeah. Things have changed, though. And, you know, the capacity is changing, the percentage of contribution to the facility. Now, the capital
You really went
cost-
from 52 to 55, so it wasn't a big.
Well, the capital costs that the town of Yarmouth is absorbing, and the fixed operating costs, which are, you know, the sum of the two was, you know, the major part of operating the plant. I'm just concerned about our representation on the committee.
Just the only other thing I'd add to that is, of course, we still have to see how this all ends up working out, but the plant's budget is a relatively small portion of our overall cost. So as Dave alluded to, the plant's 75%. I mean, the collection system for Yarmouth is 75% of our costs, and it's still our responsibility to operate that. So your point's well taken, but it's not on the whole program as presented here that we are underrepresented.
Yeah, well, it's substantial.
Right.
You know, in terms of the overall cost, and you know, and I think it goes to, you know, the other question is, okay, when we don't have a full 7 members present, you know, I think the impact of not having, for example, 4 members from Yarmouth might be even more significant. And you know, I'm feeling some discomfort with the representation at this point based upon the growing percentage of the plan. So,
Well, again, just to be clear, though, when it was 2-2-1, you had 52% of the flow at that point.
well, that wasn't a number I came up with. It was somebody else came up with that number. I didn't agree that 2-2-1 was right.
I'm not disputing, I'm just,
Yeah, I'm explaining what my feelings were at the time. I have another question I have to recall, go back and figure out what I was thinking about, so let's go on with someone else.
Okay. Oh, Mark?
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me just say, you know, each time we have this discussion on clean water, the presentation becomes better and better, more informed, and I just wanted to thank you for the quality of the presentation tonight. I think the information that we're getting is at a very high level, and it's very impressive. I also want to once again thank the Water Resources Advisory Committee for all the help that they provide in working with you and our team to provide guidance and insight in terms of how to proceed and move forward on this. My questions, and I'll try to be brief, my questions center just on a few things. First of all, in terms of our work as a select board, it's been discussed before that a priority of ours right now should be to make sure that we review the 3-town agreement, address any issues or questions such as the one that Norm has raised tonight, so that by the end of this year, we have an agreement that we're all hopefully relatively comfortable with and ready to present to town meeting. So our deadline should be early December, or to pick a date, let's say December 1, we should, as a group, hopefully the 3 towns all be on the same page with an agreement. Is that a fair?
I would agree with that, because each town needs to bring the exact same agreement to the meeting, and it's an up or down type vote. So you
Right.
need a period of time to make sure that everybody in that community is educated to what's in the agreement, why it's been put forth the way it has, and this and that. So, yes, December would, to me, be a very reasonable date.
So for the purposes of the meeting on Thursday night, I think we're going to discuss the agreement. You're going to go over it, present it, lay out the latest details on it. So hopefully by the end of the meeting, I'd like to get a sense as to how close we are in terms of consensus, in terms of moving forward, and whether or not there are some substantive or significant issues that we may still need to negotiate or address. But my hope is whatever differences we have, they're relatively narrow, because we've had this agreement, quite frankly, for quite some time. So I just wanted to get that out there. The question regarding the Buck Island site as a discharge site, what's the capability for discharge there? What's the flow? I forget.
We've felt comfortable with all the hydraulic modeling that's been done there and testing that 1.2 million gallons can be put in there. We feel it has the potential, after you actually start trying it, seeing what these off-season sets are, that you might get closer to 2 million gallons. But that would be through once you started using it. So it's 1.2 is what we feel very comfortable with.
So you're suggesting that 1.2 is sort of the safe number to be working with right now. But my understanding is it's not in order to get it permitted, we would have to spend a fair amount of money to sort of model and study, and
No, all the modeling's been
Been
done.
done.
We were one step
that's great.
shy of filing for the groundwater discharge permit back in 2011.
So I would assume in the discussions with Barnstable, is that the number that we're roughly talking about? My other question is that when a town, let's say the town of Yarmouth were to be serious about offering this discharge site for the town of Barnstable and create a partnership with another community, is that something that could generate revenue?
Yeah, and I've kind of talked about a framework for what that might look
Yep.
like, and work with Dan and his direction with Barnstable officials as to that, but.
Am I treading in some treacherous water here? Should we be
No,
getting
it's all,
ahead of
it's,
things?
I think everybody has the same understanding, so I'm not, issuing any trade secrets here, but, basically, there's got to be a cost for Barnstable or anybody to get their infrastructure there, and that's on them from our perspective. There's going to be a cost if we're discharging, even if it's treated effluent to a high degree. It's bringing additional nitrogen into our watershed, and so that would require additional sewering on our part. And so we'd expect that if we had that arrangement, that cost to us would be covered. There might be revenue opportunities with the facility itself. So, for example, if we're putting infiltration beds or spray irrigation, what's our opportunity to enhance that infrastructure by a solar PV array, for example, on top of all of it? Which
So
revenue,
all the trees would be removed?
well, they already are in a large degree.
Yeah, it's essentially a field right now.
Okay.
And so we would expect, that revenue would accrue to our benefit. So it's an incremental cost for them to bring the infrastructure there, but we get the benefit. Then there's probably one other thing I'm forgetting, but at the end of all that stack, as we call it in the profession, the capital stack, what's the incentive for Yarmouth? What's the profit margin? What's the, as you alluded to, the highest and best use of that property? Otherwise, we should at least get that.
Right.
And what other capital, political or otherwise, would you ask for someone to pay for that benefit of doing that?
So to answer the question, there is some revenue, but we just haven't figured out the amount yet.
That's right.
It would certainly be over and above the cost of what it would take to make the necessary improvements, and any additional costs to us or the town of Yarmouth.
That would be definitely be the framework of how
That
we
would be
go
the
about
framework, but is there typically an additional add-on, or I don't want to say profit, but
it. Yeah. Well, as Mr. Holcomb alluded to, there is a highest and best use of that property otherwise, so.
all right, we just have to figure out what that is. Okay, thank you. The other thing, in terms of the pond testing, one of the discussion points in an earlier slide was about the condition of our ponds. Is there a way to just be very brief, or maybe this can be just provided supplemental to the board? But I'd be very interested in knowing what we're doing to test and monitor what's the quality is of our ponds. And if you can give a brief answer, but like I said, more detail maybe later.
Yeah, there's a section written in the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. You only really have data on an annual basis on 5 ponds. You sample that through the Pond and Lake Stewards Program, PALS program. You really need to start looking and prioritizing some of your other ponds that you have public access to determine the status, water quality of those ponds. The one pond that really is shown degradation was Long Pond, and that's the one that has all the development around it.
Mm-hmm.
The other 4 don't have as much development and are in reasonable shape.
But my sense is that we get regular inquiries from the public. I mean, Dennis Pond gets a significant amount of use. There's a lot of bathing out there. I would imagine people would want to know that we're doing a fairly robust monitoring of that pond to stay on top of any particular issues out there.
Well, in terms of beaches and that stuff, your Board of Health already does that. We're talking nutrient and...
The nutrient aspects of things.
Yeah.
So the Long Pond is the one that's the most impacted. Okay. My last question on the trust fund, the Clean Water Trust Fund. I know we're hoping that, I looked at the cost recovery plan, and we have a fairly ambitious number. Is that a good way to put it? But we're looking at a lot of money hopefully coming back from that overall fund to the town. Is it realistic at all, even in terms of looking at a range, to be thinking about $933,000 perhaps on an annual basis? Or maybe I'm misreading this, Rich. Maybe there's...
Well, I don't know if that's optimistic, but I guess we have to wait and see what everybody seems to think.
I mean, I think
So-
that's a big number.
It represents, so there's been a lot of talk about projects being funded, that distributions from the fund be based on a project basis as a reimbursement, for example. And on that basis, I don't think 25% is
Okay.
too high. Other communities are using that as a basis for planning. I do know, based on our estimates, that our contributions, when I say our, I'm meaning the Yarmouth community's contributions from the additional excise tax from rooms tax is over $1.5 to $1.6 million on a Midland estimate. And so it's less than what we're putting in annually. And there's a requirement in the legislation that there be equitable distribution.
Okay.
And as part of my work, I've also been going to board members of that trust and talking to them about a financing mechanism that would encourage large contributing members to want to stay in the trust. Because if we're not staying in the trust, it doesn't have the value to the remaining members if it's not generating sufficient revenues. And so my proposal that I'm trying to hash out would be something along the lines of what we do for CPC, which is a certain percentage of revenues set aside from each community. So if Yarmouth puts in $1 million, not that we're going to get back a percentage necessarily, but let's just say 50% because it's easy math. But we would have some assurance that that percentage, $500,000, is set aside in reserve within the trust for Yarmouth's benefit, so that when it does have a project, it has funding available to pay for that project. And so it's not one town, and that the remaining percentages is an understanding that we're all in this for the greater good on a regional basis on a Cape Cod with a sole source aquifer. So there is a shared portion that gets shared amongst us all, but each community is going to get something of what they're contributing into it.
So as a follow-up, and this is my last point, so as we evaluate our role in this fund and look at it, is it fair to say that we should be at least looking at that number, that $933,000 annually as a reasonable rate of return, that should we find ourselves in a situation where we're not going to be able to access that kind of money, we might want to reassess our role or our position there?
I'm not sure I'm that far down the road, but yes, establish that amount in our financing plan so that we have some targets that we need to hit, yes.
Yeah, I think at some point, as you're doing this analysis, I think it's going to be very, very important for us to establish some targets, establish some expectations, and see if we can hold the group in its entirety accountable and put pressure on them to make sure that we get what we consider to be our fair share.
Well, some communities, one of the other aspects of the short-term rental legislation that passed was the ability to institute a community impact fee of up to 3%, which you could do in addition to the 2.75 that's also been added. Now that's a pretty heavy burden if you already have the 2.75, and now you're adding an extra 3%. But you could also withdraw from the 2.75. And the conundrum with that originally was you would be on your own, each community, in administering and collecting that, which is administratively a pretty tough road to hoe. But since then, the DOR has changed and has indicated that if a community was to adopt up to a 3% community impact fee, that they would collect it, just like they're collecting the excise tax, which makes that a much easier option, which kind of goes to my earlier point. You know, my goal would be to position that board to realize the value of having everybody participating, and so what are they offering to encourage that?
Okay. Thank you.
Tracy?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the presentation and all the hard work that's gone into this. To Mark's point and to Mark's questions, we don't know the answers to that yet. That committee has met twice. Another upcoming meeting is coming. And in the interim, a subcommittee has been working on some of those details. So I'm excited to see the details of that. But I think Rich has been a fierce advocate on that front, knowing the position that we have and the what we have in front of us. I don't know where to start. Every time we see this, it seems to get a little bit more refined and a little bit more detailed. A lot of the numbers kind of change from week to week, which makes it a little bit more difficult. But Norm was talking about the effluent recharge at Bass River, is there I guess I don't understand what that entails totally, and what that means to the golf course in terms of disruption. So I guess what I'm hearing is that there's a disruption. What's the value of that disruption, and has that been put into the cost of this plan?
Good question. What we've
Thanks,
done
I
now
get paid
is
a lot of money.
we've just put a cost allowance in as though we were working on any of the other effluent recharge sites. And that's why we're in the process now of actually costing out what it would take based on the pilot studies. We know what the infiltration rates are and this and that, so we're actually taking it to the next level to cost out what, 10, 40,000 gallon or 40,000 square foot leaching fields might look like, and this and that, where they might be. There's a golf course architect involved looking at how the holes could either be just reestablished as is or a new layout looked at. So essentially what would happen is the effluent would be pumped over to a holding tank that would be below grade on the High Bank Road north side of the golf course. And from there, it would hold up the water, the effluent would be pumped out of that holding tank to the different leaching fields that were all below a fairway. So visually, you wouldn't see it. To build it, you would see it. We need to run pipes out to each of those leaching fields. We need to put the leaching field in. I don't know if you all remember the leaching field that was put in at the Stop and Shop over here or just down the street here on 28 back a couple years ago. They ripped up the whole parking lot. It was nothing but these big plastic U-shaped plastic that they use now instead of the piping and stone and all those things. But once it was built, it was back to being a parking lot and nobody knows it's below grade. That's essentially what would happen. So what I was saying is instead of, you're not going to build it in the summertime when you have your highest revenue. You could do it start in the fall and try to build as much as you could, and then say you built half of it at that period, you'd reestablish it, get the grass back growing, and so you could use it that next summer and then come back and build the second half the next year to try to minimize
So it's not a wholesale
impact.
closing. We wouldn't need to.
We're trying to minimize the impacts on the course. Would there be closing maybe in the fall? Yes, but are you going to close it for the whole year? We're trying to avoid those types of things.
Okay. So in effluent recharge, is there any nitrogen left or any negative, anything that we need to be concerned about putting that type of gallonage back into the groundwater, whether it be there or at the water department site?
Yes. The sort of the industry standard is you can treat down to about 3 parts. So we're taking wastewater that's coming in at 35 plus parts, treating it down to 3 parts. So similar to what you do at the septic treatment plant, you use the effluent on the golf course over there. You're using it directly. You're spray irrigating it from those tanks, and that has up to 10 parts of nitrogen in it. It offsets the commercial fertilizer use on the golf course. Well, what we'd be doing here is putting it in the ground, because we don't want to build another large storage tank. It would leach down into the groundwater, but you have a well there that you draw the groundwater out of. So that would still have some small parts of nitrogen in it. But the other good news is you're down close to the mouth of the Bass River, which has good flushing. So the fact that we're putting more nitrogen in there is not harming that end of the Bass River. We do have to account for a little bit more sewering there, which had already been done in your program, as though you were using that site on your own. So the sewer service area didn't change. So yes, it's been accounted for. But it's also a benefit to the golf course.
That's why I just wanted to reiterate, as I understood that plan with the golf course, is it does have a water and fertilizer cost reduction once implemented as well. So that's all part of it. And to the obvious question, which I think you've
So
asked.
we're not utilizing fertilizer at all on the golf course in addition to this effluent? Is that what you're telling me?
No, it helps offset some of your commercial fertilizer. You still use some because of, time of year, how much you need to apply and everything. But by applying that low, steady dose, you don't need as much when they actually apply the commercial fertilizer.
I just am concerned that we're counteracting a lot of the work that we're doing, especially when you talk about, that 2 million gallons per day, whatever potentially could be coming from Barnstable. I'm not sure if you gave a projection on those possible gallons, but, you wonder if down the road it increases or degrades the water system in any, maybe even if it's minimal. I just hate to counteract what we're trying to do. So, what is the water district zoned for at this point? It's that area. Do you know what this?
Oh, the zoning of the water department?
That
I'm not
acreage.
sure off the top of my head.
It's municipal, so the value is really, you can do a thing on what it could potentially be, but it really could only be used for municipal use, right? Okay.
For what portion? There's 40 acres. How much of it is zoned municipal?
Kathy Williams, town planner. I believe it's all municipal. So there's different things that you can do. I think, like solar arrays and that type of things would be allowed, as well as like the water departments and things like that.
Okay. As far as the cost recovery, there's a lot of policy decisions, I think, that need to be made that we still haven't really addressed in terms of the use of the expanded rooms and meals tax. It's all contingent on all of those things passing either town meeting or the support of this board. And so the 25%, while it might be, probably could be ambitious, I think that there's other utilizations that you mentioned, like the offset in Barnstable, that could change it or pay for future, debt service, which would be helpful. I'm a little bit concerned about the water operation cost sharing, because we have a lot of water infrastructure, and, kicking the can down the road, we've been talking about the water infrastructure and the analysis that they're doing now. We haven't raised rates in a really long time. We know that's coming because we need to pay for our water infrastructure. So, there's just not enough money to go around, and I know we need it, but I'm concerned about what portion or what amount you're talking about, because I'm concerned that we're gonna now neglect our water system, and that would be problematic as well.
Let me just, that's a discussion, detailed discussion probably for another day, but on a high level, just because you have a consolidated enterprise fund, for example, doesn't mean you would necessarily subsidize one of the operations of that fund. And matter of fact, there might be some legal ramifications of intentionally doing that. But what I'm talking about is likely would be more along the lines of operational savings that are funded from each of the rates. So you would still have a water rate to support water costs and infrastructure. And you'd have a sewer rate that supported sewer operating costs and infrastructure, and a septage rate to support that operation, each in and of itself.
Okay. Has town council reviewed the partnership document and had any further, we haven't really talked about the partnership that much. The actual document has a lot of information in it.
Yeah, our town council has been part of that after the first iteration of changes, and then the substantive changes that came up recently over the summer. Jay's been clued in on that, so he's all along the way. It's been part of the process.
And have you done outreach, Dave, to some of the other communities to know what maybe their sticking points are still in that partnership document?
Not recently, because the documents have essentially been the same as it was since the beginning of the year. The only change was to put in the revised budget process for the 3-town selectmen's meeting to approve it. And that seemed to be sort of the last hurdle actually in all 3 towns at the time. But that's working with the subgroup that meets monthly, then some of the local subgroups. It's never been, I mean, there's been some discussions, but not thorough discussions at the Board of Selectmen level to go through the 18 sections that are in the document. So that's why, again, you know, when we didn't have the special legislation passed this fall, that was one of the things of let's take that time to make sure everyone is comfortable with it. But to Mark's point, in order to bring it to even May town meeting, we need a few months where it's sort of locked down of that's what it is. So between now and whatever, December, is when we need to have those discussions.
Okay, well, I think I'm not sure since we've gotten this presentation, from what I heard from Dan in the last couple of discussions that we have, was we weren't real confident in the value of the partnership and the dollars. Now that you've seen this, I guess the town will probably take some time to review those numbers and probably make a recommendation to us at some point that whether or not this is the way we need to continue to go. I know that the Solid Waste Committee recommended this, but there was some hesitation really that the percentage was enough to really commit to the partnership, I guess, is.
I think with every day that advances, our confidence level on the numbers gets better. Like I said, a while back, we had the additional flows that kind of upset our cost recovery, and I think probably we're pretty close to the finish line as it relates to being in a position to make a recommendation, hard and fast on that topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 2 of the questions that I brought up last time, just as my last points, is I'm concerned about the administrative percentage cap. I didn't see one. I'm not sure.
In the operation of the plant?
Yeah, in the actual operation of the partnership.
What do you mean by an administrative cap?
I don't want to see the executive director making $500,000 a year. I would like that percentage of the overhead be capped at a certain percentage, that the actual operation, the majority of the money goes into the operation. And I know that having that annual review through the board probably is helpful, but there are other organizations that do cap those types of things, and that'd be something I'd be more comfortable with. Because it's exempt from Proposition 2.5, I wouldn't want to see a runaway train. I think in our case now, our board is fairly conservative, I'd say, and would probably not relinquish that control. But I think that having those things in place for the future, knowing that what the actual intent was when it's created, because oftentimes 10 years down the road, you have a very large administrative, 20 people working there, and that wasn't really the intent of what they were trying to create. And the other thing I brought up last time was the potential for pilots and payment in lieu of taxes. And knowing that the structure's not in Yarmouth, I think that we should be concerned that a fee would be charged to us for that facility.
Dave, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't that concept of pilots raised initially, and hasn't that pretty much been dispensed with? Didn't Dennis at first raise that issue, and then they kind of gave it up?
Yeah, there was a discussion of a pilot, and the MFN has an annual payment to Norton, but that's because the facility was in Norton
It was already
originally.
built.
But it's more because the effluent recharge site that they purchased was in Norton and took 12 residential parcels off their tax roll. So that's the only reason it got put in. They pay minimal taxes, and I tried to get to the executive director today to find out what that is, and I will, and get back to you with that answer. But in terms of a pilot itself, I don't see that being implemented under the current wording, because again, if it's not in the agreement, any changes to the agreement have to go back to each of the 3 towns and pass in order to be incorporated back into the agreement.
Couldn't it be created outside of the agreement? So say a town board, the Board of Selectmen decides that they want to charge it's a separate authority.
Yeah, the issue with a pilot is a contractual agreement. It's between 2 parties. And so it's like being a vendor. One could agree with the district and a vendor, being a town or otherwise, that's an agreement that they can enter into, and, that might not hold water in the scheme of things in the context of an agreement, but it would certainly be something that you could, people could litigate all day about.
Okay,
So clarity would be, preferred, right?
Yeah, so we'll
Clarity
look into
would be
that some more.
preferred, so if it's not part of this and it has to be there, I think it should be mentioned that the towns agree to no pilots.
Yeah, we'll clearly do more homework on that and find out what needs to be incorporated, if anything, into the agreement for that.
That's all. Thank you for your work. I appreciate it. And as we move forward, I think more and more information, and we're getting down to go time, really. And I think that we need to put something before the voters so that we can start to really educate them on the need for this and what our plans are, and start having the discussions and make sure that, they're on board. So the faster that we can do that, and the faster that we can start to generate some of these revenues that we've talked about, so that way it's, like Rich said, smoothed out and not impacted on the taxes at all would be my recommendation. So thank you.
Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. I agree with some of the previous comments about the evolution of the information surrounding this project. I think it's interesting to watch it, and I appreciate that every time we get more detailed information. I am more concerned than perhaps some of the others, by the sounds of it, of the comparison to what we did in 2011. I think from being on this board in 2011 and having gone through that process, there were 2 main reasons why that project failed the way it did. Number 1, because the cost recovery plan was based largely on the tax rate, and 2, because it was an enormous number. So I think that the success or the failure of this at town meeting next spring will largely be dependent upon someone's ability to convince the taxpayers, number 1, that the cost recovery plan is not on the tax rate, which we know as of right now it's not. And number 2, that there have been significant savings realized in the last 8 years. So my question to you is, number 1, what is the savings between the 2 alternatives? What was 2011? $600 or $700 million? Was it somewhere in that ballpark for all 8 phases?
275.
255 or 275.
Yeah, no, you were less than you are now.
Yeah, the problem with that issue, that question is,
All 8?
Yeah.
there is savings in some of the work that has been done. And I keep reiterating that at the public information sessions, I cannot come up with enough revenue in a cost recovery plan to offset the effects of inflation that we're seeing in these projects. And so that's one of the major issues that our community is going to have to deal with. The cost keeps going up the longer you wait. And as Dave indicated in some of the slides, and I hate making it sound like I'm coming off, it's almost threatening, and I don't mean it that way, but we have an opportunity in front of us for a very good chance at a 0% or a subsidized loan that might not be there under other circumstances. And we have an opportunity to save money and administratively save money by working with regional partners that might not be there in the future if you don't do it now. We have an opportunity to save money, not quite yet baked into our cost plan, by coordinating road work that might not be there in the future. And more importantly, if we don't coordinate that road work, are we going to have to wait, because there's a 5-year moratorium from ripping up Route 28 once those projects go through, are we going to have to wait 10 more years beyond now because we have to wait for that moratorium to expire? And there's no way we could come up with enough revenue to offset that inflation of that next 10 years.
What were you anticipating? The 5 years would be the moratorium, and then another 5-year implementation would really put it out 10 years further?
Right, so as the map that Dave indicated of the various roadwork projects, now I know those dates are fluid and they're changing, actually getting set back a little bit, but if you had a roadwork project in 2022, and then you got to wait and say it got completed in 2022, then we got to wait 5 years to moratorium until we can address that. Well, unfortunately, that's not the only one. We've got another project coming up in 2024 and another project coming up in 2026. So you got to keep adding the 5 years at the end of that latest project. And so over the course of our next 5-year Phase 1 anticipated construction, there's at least 4 Route 28 roadwork projects that are contemplated in that period.
Can you tell me, I am having a little bit of trouble interpreting what these tables really mean, and I won't waste time getting educated on the specifics tonight. I think it would be better served spending 20, 30 minutes with Rich, but what is the difference between the regional approach, not including, any potential zero interest loans, but, between tables 25 and 27, what are the actual savings between the regional and the Yarmouth-only approach?
So I'm going to have to qualify my answer. But to me, and I appreciate all the work Dave's done, but I have been saying this for months now to everybody that would listen. We got to know what 8 phases look like, but it's too much to think of, and it's 40 years from now. We need to focus on what does Phase 1, and in this case, I asked them to put another phase in there, Phase 2, so we can see a sense of what's the next 10 years look like. And so that's slide 27.
So are the costs?
And the qualification is, these are based on 2% interest, 2.25% interest estimates. So I would like to update this for what's it look like on an anticipated 0% loan. But on this basis, so the result will be better, negligibly maybe or slightly. But right now, it looks like we're saving just under $6 million in capital and $1.7 million on operating for and this is, equivalent annual cost when you combine the operating and the debt service on the capital of just about $13 million versus $11 million per year.
So we don't need to meet. I was interpreting the tables correctly. So the real question in my mind is single-digit savings, or is a partnership worth single-digit savings? And when you say you would have to adjust those numbers, you would only adjust the regional approach to reflect what the zero-interest loan would be, correct? Because the Yarmouth-only approach would not be eligible for the zero-interest loans?
Be eligible, but not as good of a chance to get it.
Yeah, just to give you an example, Harwich right now, they're doing sewers in East Harwich. They got a 0% interest loan because that wastewater is going to the Chatham plant as part of an intermunicipal regional approach. So when we filed it, we pushed it all. It's nutrient removal, it's regional, and this and that, and they qualified for 0% interest to do their first sewer program. Whether it's going to be there or not, I don't know in the future, but that's an example.
In my quick math, Selectman Tully, the equivalent annual cost, $2 million savings, is about 15% savings.
Okay. That's based on the 13 and the 11 numbers.
Yeah, right.
Okay. I know that, what did you say, Dan? Who is going to present to us what they think is the best alternative? When you last spoke, you said that you would be making that decision coming.
Yeah, I think when Dave comes back and reports that all the due diligence on all the different fronts we're working is finalized, and we have that, it'll be presented to the Water Resources Advisory Committee, and coupled with a discussion there, I have all the anticipation that we would endorse what that looks like between the committee and the town administration so that we give you some guidance on that. And we'd also go to the finance committee as well as part of that.
All right, thank you.
I think it's fair to say we appreciate the stakes from the 2011 situation, so whatever that recommendation ends up being, it's going to be as diligently vetted as possible before we give it to you.
Okay, Norm had a couple other more questions, I guess.
Yes, thank you. I'd come back to the comment that Tracy made about the consolidation of the water department, wastewater treatment, and the septage operations. And I share her concern, especially when we've got major capital plans hanging out there for the water department. But I think I'd like to know if there are any cost savings built into this as a result of a potential consolidation of those departments.
I would say yes, but that's to be determined. So we're going through a budget process for this upcoming fiscal year. And Jeff Colby has been reporting to you the status of work that he's been doing in the water department. And we'll have some recommendations coming from that, and as far as a master plan he's been doing associated with that. So as we move forward in the annual budget process this year and more largely next year, where we might have to contemplate some of these changes, that's where we'd have an opportunity to combine some operating costs, if it makes sense.
Okay, and I guess the other question on that is whether there's anticipated revenue that is attributable to the water department that would be utilized for wastewater purposes, and if so, has that been put into this calculation?
There's been no contemplation of doing anything like that.
So it's not, we're not in effect asking everybody in town that's on town water to participate in the wastewater plant?
No.
Okay, that's fine. That's really what the direction I was headed in. Every time the golf course issue comes up, I mean, it adds a more complex wrinkle, and you guys have your hands full, and you've done a great job with the calculations, as well as trying to plan this out and communicate with everyone on this. The whole golf course issue adds another wrinkle, as I said earlier. One of the things that I initially started thinking about when I first heard of that was, oh my gosh, how long is the golf course going to be impacted? And most importantly, we've got a fair number of employees there at the golf course that, their livelihoods, their families depend on their incomes from the golf course operations. And, I don't know how all that gets factored into this, but, I don't think that we should be thinking about, oh, well, those folks can just go on unemployment. No, I don't think we should be thinking that way. We need to be thinking about if the golf course is going to be out of commission, we need to make sure that our employees' salaries are fully funded so that we don't have economic impact on our families here in this town.
So one of the things, similar to the discussion last week or 2 weeks ago with the CPC, now that we've moved along in this process, now is an appropriate time, but you're 100% correct. That's one of those details that we need to start fine-tuning and honing in on and setting up what's a transition plan look like. And we're going to have to make decisions along the way on that. Do you want to do it as a seasonal shutdown, or do you want to do 9 holes 1 year, 9 holes, there's a lot of different ways to skin that cat. But yes, we need to come up with what that transition looks like. And I am a Town of Yarmouth employee, looking out for the best interests of the Town of Yarmouth, so to the extent there's impacts or more particularly lost revenues to the town, that's part of the project costs as far as I'm concerned that I would advocate for, so.
Certainly wouldn't want, as I said, our employees who work very hard at that course to be personally impacted or their families to be impacted as a result of this. And I think that's something we need to work to avoid. Okay. Thank you.
I didn't want to,
Again, this is a tremendous amount of detail here and a lot of wrinkles.
there's just- we haven't gotten
you've
to
done a
that
great
level of
job with
detail.
it. Thank you.
and there's a lot of work just to get to this point, so, I hear what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense to even really dwell on that transition plan and what that might look like unless we're gonna do, if I have a good indication that we might go down the path of doing DHY, because otherwise I don't need to even worry about it.
Agreed.
So, if this showed that it's gonna cost us more money, then I'm sure we'd be walking away at this point and not even worried about it, but.
I just have a couple, in view of the lateness of the hour, just a couple items I wanted to address. Like Norm, I have a real concern about the golf course, not only in terms of the employees, but in terms of the memberships, attrition. We're struggling right now with the golf courses to try to reach a break-even point, and I think this is going to be very upsetting to that strategy. People are going to know about this in advance. They're going to know these golf courses are going to be disturbed, and they might opt to become members of golf courses in other localities and maybe not come back afterwards. So I think that's a piece that has to be looked at very, very carefully. In terms of the interest-free loans, is there any guidelines or any cap on the amount that would be eligible for those loans? For example, if you're talking, let's say, Phase 1 and Phase 2, because I think Rich gets a headache thinking beyond that, for good cause, when we're talking about a 40-year project. But whatever the cost is of those two phases, is there any guidelines as to how much of that cost will be eligible, or is it all eligible, or do they have some kind of, rough percentage that's eligible?
Dave might have more details, but in the high level, there's no cap, I don't believe, on our project reimbursement or availability for that loan subsidy. But the program itself is limited to, I think it's a third of the pool from the state is 0% financing.
Okay.
Yeah, the state, the amount of money they have varies each year. Depends on how much they get from the federal government, their matches that the state puts in. But to give you an example, if you put in for a $50 million loan to do a project, they would probably stretch that over your construction period. So they may give you $20 million the first year, and $15 million the second year, and $15 million the third year, so that they're stretching the dollar in different program years for them. So that's how they do
Would
it.
they all have long-term amortizations? By that, I mean approximately 30 years, or would they have
Yeah, no, they
a
switched-
staggered basis? Would they be shorter than that?
No, they switched, it was either 2 or 3 years ago, from 20-year bonds to 30-year bonds, and they give that option to the community.
Okay.
The community can still do 20-year if they choose, but most, because of the cost today, are electing to go to 30-year bonds.
Okay. And just to, not to get into the detail of it, but the methodology of your cost comparisons for estimated savings, you take the operational costs, and then you translate those into like a total cost savings. So obviously with capital, you're using an assumed interest rate, is it 2.5%?
We're doing the 2.25, which is the 2% loan, and then they put a 0.25 administrative fee on over a 30-year bond.
So 2.5, and you're doing it on the basis of 30 years, and then calculating what that payment is annually, and
And add
then
in the
adding
element.
it into the operational costs. Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Anyone else have anything?
I'm going to just follow up on a comment that Norm made about golf. Not usually not my favorite topic, but I'm really concerned because what I'm interested in knowing is if let's say the town of Yarmouth, for whatever reason, the 3-town option was off the table. and all we're doing now is we're looking at solving this ourselves. What I'm curious about are where are the discharge sites in Yarmouth to handle a projected 3.5 million, I'm sorry?
Well, right now-
3.5 million gallons a day.
The primary would be Buck Island Road, but that doesn't quite fill the bill, so we're
Not at all.
still
That's
dedicated
1.2.
to using the Bass River Golf Course, maybe not in your phase one, but, 15, 20 years
So
down.
that probably means more discharge to that golf course and possibly another golf course,
Yeah,
right?
your two sites were the Bass River Golf
Right.
Course and Buck Island Road site.
Right, but that doesn't provide enough volume, I don't believe.
Well, it's 2 million at Bass River and 1.2, potentially up to 2
But
at
that's
Buck
cutting it
Island,
close.
so that gets you your 3.5.
So that means that if there is an option with Barnstable, that's off the table.
If you do your in-town solution, yes.
Got it. Are there other potential options for discharge outside of Yarmouth? Possibly in another town? Is there,
You've probably heard me say many times previously that the most difficult part of any wastewater program is finding acceptable effluent recharge sites. They're like gold. That's why Barnstable is very interested in your site if you join DHY.
I understand. But if we do that, then it means that our options are constrained in somewhat as well.
Well, our agreement with Barnstable would be for a term of years. Obviously, they're not going to want to spend all that money for 5 years, but would they do it for 20 or 25 or 30? It expires. It'd probably be through an IMA type arrangement.
Did we ever look at Bayberry Hills at all as a site for discharge?
A lot of that is close to your Zone 2s, and it's in your Aquifer Protection District.
So that
That's
would-
why we've had
That
to
would be
do
problematic.
a lot of modeling just to be able to use the reclaimed water
Got
on
it.
the surface at Bayberry Hills.
Got it. So when you gave us that initial slide showing our water protection district, our aquifer protection district, it takes up roughly almost half the town. So you tend to try to avoid that area for discharge, which sort of limits our options here in Yarmouth. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
One last question. Do you anticipate any issues from any of the regulatory agencies with the environment on the discharge site at the Bass River Golf Course?
I'd like to say no, because they've been aware of it. It's been in your previous comprehensive wastewater management plan. But we've done the modeling now that is almost ready to file a groundwater discharge permit, and that's when you actually go through the full regulatory review process. We've had discussions with local DEP folks, Brian Dudley and all. We've invited him to some of the meetings to keep him up to date. And, he hasn't expressed any reservations at this point. So they actually like it because, again, you can pull the groundwater up, which has a little nitrogen in it, and use it on the golf course to offset fertilizer applications.
Okay, anyone else? All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
We're going to move on to the next phase of this.
Should be the district improvement financing part of the
Yes,
conversation?
and that's going to be Lou Nicanello.
That's correct.
And is he alone, or did he bring a consultant with him?
I think it's just Lou.
Lou, is it just you, or did you bring a consultant with you, or a team of consultants, or an army of consultants?
I can't afford any of them.
It's just going to be you? Okay.
It's just going to be me. Chris Bailey was supposed to be here, but he was in Kansas meeting with some of the people interested in my project, and he missed his connection. And the consultant that we've retained to help us with the district improvement financing is in Westfield and tied up personally. So it's basically, I appreciate, number one, Mr. Chairman and the board members for giving me an opportunity to be part of this workshop. I have last been involved with the town
Thank you.
back when we did the zoning for the overlay. I've been, since that favorable effort by the community in passing that overlay, trying to implement part of it, at least that part that has to do with my property. And I have to tell you, it's been a struggle on a couple of fronts, but most important, the subject you've been talking about is the primarily one. I am asking this board to sponsor an article for this special town meeting for a very good reason. It's not to talk about sewer. You're working on that, and I compliment you and the committee for the work you're doing. I pray that you'll be successful as quick as possible. But I know this board and the town has been very interested in trying to do economic development on 28 and bring 28 back to life. And to the point, I just went to a forum invited by the town where they talked about the opportunity zones, and that's also funding for development. And I was invited to be as a stakeholder at that meeting. So I've retained certain people, spent some money to research different ways of approaching my development on wastewater on my property. I certainly have enough property, more than most, to contain myself on my own property. But that's not the way to go. We've had too many private package plants built in this town and not helping us in our environment and not helping us further our efforts. In the overlay zoning, we are permitted to cross our boundary lines, and I can go next door and create my own system. And in meeting with my neighbors, we have a problem in creating our own system. And everyone that we speak to insists that we have the town involved in whatever we do. So we explored private-public partnerships, like the town of Easton, and they created that. But the consultant that I retained came back with this district improvement financing. So all I'm here talking about is not sewer, but another mechanism to finance wastewater through improvement of our properties that has been the goal of this community. For instance, if you adopt an article at this special town meeting sponsored by this board that gives us the creation of the district running from Long Pond down beyond Parkers River to Bog Road, we can then spend some money privately between the special town meeting and the annual town meeting to ascertain what improvements can be made in that zone that you've already established that will finance from those improvements, the appraised value being increased, to help pay for the structure you finally vote on, whether you're going to build the system internally or you're going to build it through Tri-Town. We will be able to help provide your committee and you with that raw data, surveying my neighbors as to what is the projected cost, and for those who won't be in making the improvements, what will be the betterment they'll pay to be on that sewer line. It's work that you would do on your own at a later date once you make all your decisions, as you've heard today. So I'm not talking about getting into the sewer business. I'm talking about having businesses not being in the sewer business, but I'm desperately in need of helping this town get in the sewer business for the benefit of everybody, whereby it's been the concern of the citizens of this community that the users pay the lion's share of the cost. And that's what this district establishes. So if, and timing is important, if I have to wait, and by the way, some people have said, why don't you get a citizen's petition? Well, that won't work, because we haven't had a vote of this board in the town meeting on establishing that they want to go forward with wastewater. As a matter of fact, 2011, they said no. So we need to, as you have been doing, trying to inform the public how important it is for us to get into the wastewater business as a community. We in the business community, at least through the efforts that I intend to lead, will help you ascertain another way of financing in addition to the other areas that you must consider. And that's what this DIF district is all about. So while you're making your decisions and getting ready for your next annual town meeting, if you give me this article at this special town meeting, I will spend the money between now and the spring of my own revenue to get some of those answers for you. And that's all I'm asking for this board to sponsor is an article establishing the district financing, period. And we hope your timing is accelerated, but at that special town meeting, I hope to have some answers that will help you in your consideration. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Did I miss anything?
Very good.
And the language, our consultants will be working with just the town administration to establish the correct language that the board would sponsor. And the board would sponsor it on behalf of the community with the business community. That's why I don't want it to be a citizen's petition. This is something that needs to be embraced because you created the overlay district, you created an opportunity zone. This is only a financing mechanism that would hopefully establish that district and give us a route towards redevelopment. If you could give me that, I have people interested in our project that I've been talking about for 10 years that would step up to the plate because we're going to finally have a formal action by this board in town meeting establishing this DIF district.
Tracy.
Well, first of all, Mr. Nicanello, thank you. Thank you for your continued commitment to the community and support and looking for different ideas out of the box. I think that is going to help us get where we are. I can't say that I know the ins and outs of what this means in terms of potential impacts, but I'm very interested in looking at it further. I very much would support an article for town meeting, and I think we need to work together between now and then with the different committees. I'd like to hear from Rich what this does to his overall plan that he just presented, if it has an impact. Obviously, the planning board, and what it really means overall in the mechanics of it. So, but generally speaking, I think we need to at least put the placeholder on now as we flush things out. And I'm very familiar with your plan and the overlay. We've been talking about redevelopment, and you know, this is a huge thing for us. You know, the more I think about the 10 years that Rich talked about, or 5 years, till we even get a pipe in the ground, you know, and I think what that really does mean to our business community as they're slowly really having a hard time and they're not investing. So not only are in the next 5 years, our impacts going to be environmental. I think we're slowly seeing a decline in our commercial tax base, which I think is very detrimental to the health of our community overall. So I think, you know, we've said for years that new growth usually spurs new growth, new investment spurs new investment. So if we can get something like this off the ground, I think that you know, it really could potentially change where we're going in the future. So, but as far as the overall plan, I think Rich, I know at one point in time we had talked about the utilization of new growth for funding future phases. So I guess just how this fits into the plan.
Sure, and this is Lou's show, so I certainly don't want to steal it, but I told him I would be available to talk on the technical aspects of it.
Yeah, if he could just explain in more articulate language than I could what the DIF represents in the different aspects, lacking my ability to have the people associated with who know more about it than I. I'm just a layman.
You did great.
Just like all of you, and I have some comprehension. I understand the various mechanisms, but as I understand it, this diff would only deal with all the, if you establish the diff, you establish the appraised current value of the property that exists in the diff district. And any improvement beyond that goes directly to tax base, the taxpayers, and a portion of that increase in value can be used to fund your infrastructure. So it doesn't come off the tax rate, it doesn't take anything away from the present taxes. So if, for instance, we go forward and I'm in the diff, and I have my plans to develop 25 acres, and I put in $40 million of increased value in my property that's going to be assessed, and whatever the tax rate is at the present $10, that represents over $400,000 more in tax dollars. A portion of that will be dedicated to the improvement or the creation of the sewer. And that's basically what the diff district represents financially.
Does it front load that? Like, I'm just trying to figure out what the benefit is. I can see the benefit to the town, but what's the benefit to the developer to having the diff?
Because they don't have to finance and raise capital money to build a treatment plant on the property, and they're gonna be paying through their taxes anyway, the taxes. The town is gonna get additional tax money through the improvements of that property because of the sewer.
So the increase actually goes back into the district, though, not to the town?
That goes to the town. And a portion of it will be dedicated to pay for the sewer improvement.
Okay.
That's how it works. Maybe
So Lou's explained.
Richard can explain.
Lou's
better
explained it great, and I've had a conference call with his consultants, and we've talked this out a little bit. And on the this is new to us. It was an area that the RAC, I was going to work with the RAC to discuss further as alternatives to what we're talking about in the event that we couldn't muster the support for our current plan. But on the surface, and my early response, just to give you some context, is I think it's a great idea. And why do I think it's a great idea? Because it's pretty much exactly what I've proposed to you. Lou's diff district is Route 28, Parkers River to Long Pond Road. Phase 1 is Route 28, Barnstable to Dennis. It's just a bigger diff. Part of our funding plan to fund that Phase 1 was the contemplation of new growth in our tax base, just as Lou explained. In our financing plan that you're aware of now, of the $3.7 million of debt service and how we pay for it without hitting the tax rate, I have contributed zero of new growth to that plan. But as you might recall, when I met with you individually on my spreadsheet that I had developed on this, the first 5 years we had projected, based on the UMass Donahue study report, $1 million of new growth, $250,000 a year, or $200,000 a year for the first 5 years, and another $1 million over the subsequent 5 to 15 years, I believe. And I just cut it off there because the numbers become staggering after that. So there was significant new growth projected because of our wastewater development. So I wholeheartedly agree with Lou that new tax growth can pay for this substantially. And when you combine that with a betterment, which is part of the Lou's DIF proposal, which is also part of the RAC's concept financing plan, it secures it. But in either event, the new growth has to be there.
Now, one addition before we conclude that statement. Approval of this town meeting article does not commit the town to implement the wastewater system, because it's on your timetable based upon the work you're doing, or to spend any money. All it enables me to do, as one property owner, that the town established the district, which just mirrors what you've already established in the overlay or the opportunity zone, because there are people, matter of fact, with the gentleman in the audience now, Mike Kelly, who came to me through the town, who have people ready to invest in the opportunity zone that you've designated, which surrounds the property that I own. They're on a timetable. We have to have some definitions by a certain date, and this program under the Trump tax program expires in 2027. So if you get this established now while you do your work, I can come up with some answers and attract some people who have been interested in what I've visioned and would like to be part of it, who have money to park for the capital gains opportunities they will be taking advantage of. And that's why it's urgent and why I've asked to be on this agenda and to try to get on the special town meeting, because my consultant will come in and explain this to the voters at special town meeting. I'll be engaging him with a Phase 2 contract to work from now to town meeting to explain how the town will benefit from this creation of the DIF.
So the process related to that, and I've already initiated it with town council in the event that you're inclined to want to support something or move on something. And so Lou's right, and I'm just confirming my understanding. I've worked with these districts and other communities over the years when I was a consultant. And what he's contemplating is a two-phased approach. The legislation requires that there is a plan, a development plan, and it requires that there's a financing plan. And so what Lou is asking you to do is to define the district so that between now and town meeting, he can develop that development plan and that financing plan by approaching his neighbors and the business community. And what he really, in cutting to the chase, what you're really asking for is a development agreement. If we did this, what could you sign up for?
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we place the article for the proposed DIF district for a special town meeting.
Well, I think before we do that, I think we should hear from the other board members and see if they have any questions from Lou. Eric, do you have any questions?
I was ready to second it, but my question is the DIF essentially the extent of Phase 1? Is that what the ask is?
The DIF is a smaller Phase 1. And just to give you a little more detail on it,
It's between Long Pond and Bog Road, is that what
but the
you're
other,
referring to?
and so this would allow Lou to move forward in soliciting agreements, but would require a vote at a subsequent town meeting, he's suggesting May, to vote and accept the development plan and the financing plan, basically his results that he wants to report back. And if you were then to accept that, then you could move forward on assessing the baseline values versus the increased values. That being said, one of the details of this plan, development plan, and talking to Lou's consultants is it is reliant upon the town agreeing to a public-private partnership for the Buck Island Road site. And so this, Lou's talking about the DIF for the collection system would still have to be treated, and the treatment would be at Buck Island Road. That's a decision for May, though.
But that's only if you go alone. If you go to the Tri-Town, then the treatment would be somewhere else and be the same pipeline that's on 28. All I'm doing is collecting the data and giving a forecast as to how much is going to be invested in this area, and it's happened to be the exact area the town wants redeveloped. And we will be able to track hopefully some of the opportunity fund money. And that, at the meeting we had, the town sponsored last week, they said there may be some opportunity money that could be used for the wastewater if we come up with those answers. But those are the things we'll establish between the fall town meeting and the annual town meeting next year, when you hope to go to town meeting for the overall plan that you decide on.
Go on.
Thanks. I would join Eric's second on this. I don't see any bad news in this. This is all good news. So a couple of technical questions. New growth, does that mean new construction and increase in value of existing property?
It's as you understand it, it's increased tax base.
I'm sorry?
It's increased tax base, tax revenue.
Okay, all right.
So in
it
the
could
case of the
come from-
commercial,
Could
it's
come
not,
from either new construction, or it could come from an
Business
increase in
revenue.
value of the existing properties. And because maybe their occupancy increased, whatever the case may be,
But it's based upon your appraisal.
Right.
The town does.
Understand.
And the
Yes.
increased value from the
Assessment,
time you adopt the DIF for any improvements going on, and it also attracts anyone who is not, who wants to be on the system, will pay a betterment.
Right.
For instance, Captain Parker. Captain Parker is the greatest example. Paying thousands and thousands of dollars, you go in that parking lot and you can still smell the odor. And he'll never get resolved. And there's another issue. The engineer we're using happens to live at Parkanocket. And the reason we went down there with the zone, not only the red jacket, but all those houses along Parkanocket are under stress. That's all filled land, and their systems are failing, and they can't reconstruct them. And so we proposed down Neptune and Parkanocket, and not Seaview, where the town just redid it with sidewalks, right down the area, right to the red jacket, and then you're already down on South Shore Drive to see where else you want to go. So it's a natural route, and the engineer we've retained has come up with that.
Well, you know, all that really points to the untapped potential for Yarmouth in terms of what could happen with as much speed as we can implement a good wastewater plan and creative thinking like this. So, you know, it's all good news.
Okay, Mark.
In the interest of full disclosure, I have to acknowledge that I used to work for Lou. I used to shag golf balls when I was a kid, my first job here on Cape Cod. I, too, support putting this on the warrant. I want to just note that this brings with it potential opportunities for grant funding. The Trump administration has made as a priority, has sort of issued a directive to federal agencies to find ways to underwrite infrastructure projects in these zones. Now, how much money might be there, what might be there, we don't know. But I think what happens is should this continue to move forward, it opens up the door potentially for federal funding to help underwrite some of this work as well. So it becomes another way of helping finance creatively some of the work that we all know needs to be done. So I think the next step is obviously for you and your consultants to sort of work with our staff in refining what's going to be necessary for the article. And then I think giving an opportunity for the committees in town to sort of work with you and help them develop recommendations so that we can hear what they recommend, what the others recommend.
Because the legislature in 2016 gave the authority to the community without going back to them to establish this kind of district. And we couldn't write the article because we need direction from the town as to where it's going to be administered. And it's not for a citizen to say. It's up for the administration to recommend to your board on how that diff will be administered.
Right.
And so that's why you haven't got an article in language. Our consultant's ready to work with the town to get the correct language for the warrant.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. We're ready to vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, so it carries unanimously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rich.
Okay, vote on town election date.
Yes,
Phil.
Mr. Chairman, I have a handout for you from last week. I just brought it back to your attention about the two different date potentials.
Oh, yeah.
Phil Goodette's here, the town clerk.
You don't like Phil?
Yeah, I just feel Betty had to sit for all that time.
Pass that on.
Oh, sure.
I think there's only one.
How you doing, Phil?
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah.
Yeah, essentially, what this memo says is, it comes down to,
Hold on one second, Phil.
Hit the gavel. Go ahead, you know you want to.
Do you want me to do that?
Yeah. Can we please have quiet?
We're still in the middle of a meeting, folks.
Anyone who wants to speak, please leave the room so we can proceed. Go ahead, Phil.
because of the bidding process regarding the DPW building, it's placed a timeline on when we can have the election. I proposed two dates, November 5th or Friday, November 15th. And it comes down to just absentee balloting. If we have it on November 5th, which is a which is a state and, nationally known election date, which I support. That's the date I would like. Leaves us for 2 weeks to have the absentee balloting. And then option 2, November 15th, gives us 3 weeks. There's no state law that says that dictates the length of time for absentee balloting. It's the Elections Division recommends 21 days. But for, probably the reason why there is no law for absentee balloting is for issues like this when it comes to the RFP process. So I support November 5th. We'll be able to get the absentee, but if anyone comes in before that and they request an absentee ballot, we can mail them out to them, and we even call people to let them know when they're in. So.
And will you let them know when they take them that's the deadline? I think that maybe that's important too.
Correct, yes.
I make a motion that we support the vote on town election date for Tuesday, November 5th.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to support
Special town election
November
date.
5th for the special town election date.
Do we have to say anything about the absentee ballots, or is that?
No, that pretty much runs from that date, right? And
Yeah,
the date
so it'll run,
triggers the mechanism for that.
Okay.
Okay, any discussion? All those in favor? Say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? All right, so that passes 4-0. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So, Mr. Chairman, the last item in front for consideration tonight is to get the November meeting schedule approved as far as when you'd like to meet. So the 5th is an election day. We have met on an election day before. So, but I know some people are traveling and whatnot, and we need to get at least 2 meetings in.
Who had the difficulty with it? Norm, you were one, right? You had some
Right,
conflict there. Was it Eric had some conflict as well?
Had conflicts that entire month,
The whole month?
pretty much.
I won't be available November 5th, but, I will not be available November 12th either. I'm
Okay.
leaving on the 30th, returning on the 13th, so, obviously, if you wanted to hold a meeting on another day of the week, that'd be fine as far as I'm concerned, but I don't think that you need to address the schedule.
October
for
30th,
my-
so when was the return date, Norm?
November 13th.
13th.
Yep.
Okay, so he's out the 5th and the 12th.
We meet the 19th. That's all.
And are you out those 2 days, Eric?
Yeah, I will, the only Tuesday that I am positive that I will be available right now is the 19th.
Okay. And that's Thanksgiving week, right?
No, it's the week before.
Is it the week
Thanksgiving.
before? All right, so it looks like we can do one of them on the 19th then, right?
When's the 19th? That's already been determined. It's the other ones, right?
Yeah, right, it's
Yeah,
one of the
everybody
ones.
will be here on the 19th, I guess.
So, Mr. Chairman, because I do need to schedule the National Golf Foundation presentation, because they'll have their final report, and they want to get in front of the board. Is it possible that you would consider perhaps not a Tuesday, but the 14th of November, which would be a Thursday night? That way, Mr. Holcomb would be here, and that would also be able to get us in that meeting, that second meeting, because that report is kind of critical to get some of our planning underway for the future. So I didn't want to really delay that much beyond that.
That's fine with me.
Eric, are you around on the 14th? No. Tracy, are you here?
Yeah,
Mark?
I'm a loser.
So do you want to do a Thursday meeting? It's,
I'm fine.
Does that still meet the criteria of the charter?
yeah, as long as it's 2 a
Business,
month.
right? Doesn't
yeah.
matter when, it's not
Yeah.
regular, okay.
The big thing is we should get a notice out as quick as we can that there's going to be a meeting on that day because people are not accustomed to following us on Thursdays.
So the 14th and the 19th.
14th, I guess, and 19 looks like the 2 days.
Come sit in a tree, you're more than welcome.
No, thanks.
Live stream us.
So we in agreement on that? 14 and 19?
Yep.
All right, so let's do that then, Dan.
Great, thank you very much, I appreciate that.
Do we have anything else?
No, that's it.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, all those in favor? Aye.
One comment. No, just one comment.